Probably many of you are aware that, nonviolent strategies of change really have their roots in many different religious traditions. Jainism is probably from India, is probably one of the most sort of explicit in its nonviolent commitments, but Buddhism, Christianity, many other religious traditions teach nonviolence in various ways, in various contexts. And of course, in the Western world more recently, in the last few centuries, various peace churches such as the Quakers and the Mennonites have played, a really important role in nonviolent struggles. Many of them became abolitionists, for instance, in the US during slavery, and committed to nonviolent principles. Writers like Henry David Thoreau and Leo Tolstoy advocated nonviolence through non-cooperation with injustice. I'm sure a lot of this is familiar with you. In the late 1800s, there was really a sort of expansion of nonviolent strategies with boycotts and labor strikes and other things growing in popularity. And just after the turn of the century, early 1900s, Gandhi observed those and began to sort of draw on these various traditions and strategies, as well as his own religious sort of roots, and formulated eventually what became, I'm sure most people would sort of recognize as the most sort of comprehensive philosophy of nonviolent change. And he certainly refined a lot of nonviolent strategies you're all very familiar with. And other movements after, the Gandhian independence in India, like the US civil rights movement, played a huge role in popularizing these. And after the civil rights movement, academics began to pay pretty close attention to these strategies, began to study them. One in particular is a fellow named Gene Sharp. Spent the better part of his life studying, documenting, writing about nonviolent strategies. And he, in many ways, kind of secularized those strategies, invited people to consider that whether or not you have religious convictions underlying your nonviolence, that these strategies still can be very effective in purely pragmatic ways. And after Gene Sharp started writing about these things, a growing number of nonviolent movements around the world have taken up nonviolent principles. And right now we live in a time when actually there's a sort of global exchange of learning about nonviolence happening very systematically, a sort of growing body of knowledge about nonviolent strategies. But what I want to sort of explore with you tonight is what is an often overlooked aspect of nonviolent social change that I refer to as radical constructive agency. So I'll talk about what that means, but let me set the stage first, just by sort of noting most nonviolent practice is based on the premise that in our struggles for social change, the means that we employ should probably be consistent with the ends that we seek, right? In other words, the methods we use should be consistent with the goals that we're aiming for. So if we want to live in a world free of violence, we probably ought to pursue it through nonviolent means, right? If we want to live in a world free of injustice and oppression, we should probably pursue that through means that are just. And Gandhi wrote a lot about this, what he called the inseparability of means and ends, or methods and goals, right? And he argued that our means actually determine our ends, or they prefigure our ends. They give shape to our ends. That was actually the basic premise of all of his thinking. And he wrote a lot about that, this kind of means and ends question. And it led him to recognize that radical constructive action, or what he called actually the constructive program, that was his language, is actually the most important form of social change, the most important means. But it's one that many people have overlooked. So that's what I want to explore. To put it in simple terms, Gandhi sort of developed two broad kinds of social change. The strategies most people are familiar with, like civil disobedience and so forth, those he referred to as contentious means or contentious strategies, in contrast with constructive strategies. So contentious strategies basically, pit a movement against some adversary. Like in India with Gandhi, that was the British Raj, this oppressive, colonial system. And so contentious means essentially try to set up a sort of moral dilemma for the adversary in which no matter what they do, they'll lose the moral sympathies of the population and of bystanders. So civil disobedience, breaking unjust laws in very public ways in which the authorities need to either respond, with violence and force or just ignore it. That's the kind of moral dilemma that Gandhi perfected. And we've seen those strategies employed in the civil rights movement and many other places since. Those are contentious means because really they set up a conflict, even though it's a nonviolent conflict, right? But by the constructive means that Gandhi talked about are of a different nature. And Gandhi's constructive program, it was about actually building new, more just patterns of community life and new institutional structures to support them, with the goal of actually supplanting or replacing the oppressive social system. Literally like building a new social order within the shell of the old. And what Gandhi foresaw was, if you can mobilize enough people to build up new social patterns, the oppressive social patterns don't need to be confronted in contentious ways. They'll actually collapse through attrition as people abandon them. Now, Gandhi wasn't able to mobilize enough of his, fellow Indians behind his constructive program. He tried, and he got a lot of people involved in those efforts. But even a lot of his peers who were struggling for independence didn't take the constructive work seriously and focused much more on his contentious strategies. And after he passed away, that's almost the only thing people remember about Gandhi is his, civil disobedience, the Salt March, and these other sort of contentious strategies. So in my own recent kind of research and scholarship, I've been really trying to shed light on this idea of a constructive program, or what I prefer to call radical constructive action. And by radical, I don't mean, extremist or violent. I mean, the original meaning of the root radical, or of the word radical, means getting to the root, right? Radical literally is the Latin word for root. So when I talk about radical action, I'm talking about action that gets to the root or the underlying causes of injustice, for instance. And what I'm starting to try to write about and argue is that we tend to overlook and ignore constructive action of this kind, in part because it's not as dramatic. And so many of the stories we want to tell are about drama and conflict. Historians prefer to write about conflict. Journalists certainly prefer to report about conflict. But even academics generally are focused on conflict. And the constructive program, the constructive action tends to be more quiet. So I've been trying to sort of think about how do we begin to tell these stories, recognize historical examples of this in order to also like expand our social imagination about what's possible in the future. So let me give you some examples that I think illustrate radical constructive action. And maybe we can sort of explore further, and you might have other examples. And we can also think about the relationship between this kind of work and the contentious sort of nonviolent strategies. So one of the examples I think we need to actually begin to understand more clearly is the example of the earliest Christian communities. And I'm talking about the first 1, 2, 3 centuries after the death of Christ. And if any of you know much about that early Christian history, what those early Christians were involved with primarily was building up radically new patterns of community life. Patterns based on equality, compassion, charity, patterns that were quite different than the sort of prevailing social order of the Roman Empire in which they were occurring, which was based on violence and domination and exploitation and slavery and many other patterns like that. So the earliest Christian community, it really was an example of radical constructive action that had a transformative impact on that whole region of the world. Now, the latter Christian history is a little more complicated, and the Crusades and the religious wars in Europe, and we don't need to sort of get into that. But those first few centuries are a really clear example. I think another place that we can find really clear examples of what I call radical constructive action is actually by sort of rereading the history of African Americans who are struggling for justice. So, when I talk to most of my friends, students, colleagues about the struggle for racial justice in the United States, what most of them think about is the civil rights movement, in the late 50s and 60s, and the sit-ins, the boycotts, the civil disobedience, the marches, basically, right, the contentious strategies, which certainly were effective at helping dismantle some very oppressive, Jim Crow laws in the South, for instance. But what most people don't think about is the really radical constructive work African Americans were involved in long before the civil rights movement. And what were they building up? Well, they were building churches, they were building schools, they were building a system of colleges and universities. There are about 400 Black colleges and universities that were built across the United States. They were building libraries, a Black press, hospitals, mutual aid societies, legal aid societies, economic cooperatives. And I could go on and list, other examples, but the point is they were building new patterns of social life and new institutional, systems to support those that were fundamentally different than those available to them in the wider society. How were they different? They were different because all these new patterns and these new institutions valued Black lives, right? And beyond those examples I mentioned earlier, African Americans were also constructing entirely new forms of culture and the arts that were part of that radical constructive program. So one can also begin to look there for examples. The problem is the history of African Americans hasn't been told through that lens. Another place we can begin to look in Latin America in recent decades, there have been some quite impressive examples of radical constructive agency. So you've all probably heard of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico. Even though that movement began in its first couple years with some armed conflict, it actually very quickly transformed into a brilliant example of constructive action, because what the Zapatistas have been doing for the last 20 years is actually building new patterns of community life, new systems of education, new systems of self-governance, new economic cooperative arrangements that are basically have displaced the, the sort of inherited social order of Mexico in which those indigenous people had been living and suffering. And they still have work to do, but they've been very focused on that constructive sort of transformative project now for a couple of decades. Further south, if we go to Latin or to South America, we can look at Brazil. Some of you might have heard of something called the landless workers movement in Brazil. It's one of the largest social movements in Latin America. This is hundreds of thousands of peasants in Latin America who have had no land, living in poverty, while large tracts of land owned by a very tiny fraction of the, super wealthy Brazilian elites lies unused. Farmland. I'm not talking about, Amazon jungle. I'm talking about land that was cleared, generations ago for farmland, lies unused. And this landless workers movement have been essentially moving onto this land, engaging legal processes to claim title, of which they've been successful, and building up new patterns of community life. Again, new schools, radically different curriculum that's focused on, economic cooperation and sort of self-governance, building up new systems, new methods of self-governance, all of this kind of in the shadows of ultimately a sort of corrupt and oppressive, Brazilian system that has excluded them. So these are a few examples one can look at. Another example, and this one I've looked at fairly closely because it's one I participate in, is the example of the worldwide Baha'i community, which has been, among other things, building up, I think, the most innovative, electoral processes one can find anywhere on the planet for essentially, democratic governance 2.0, as I think about it, without parties, without competition, without nominations, without the corrupting influence of money, and as well as a host of other sort of patterns of community life that really are fundamentally about trying to build a new social order from the ground up. So those are all just a range of examples that illustrate what I mean and what Gandhi was envisioning when he was talking about a sort of constructive program. And I'll just say a few more things and then, kind of open this up for discussion. One is to really take seriously the possibility of radical constructive action. One needs to have a sort of expanded conception of power. So when most people think or talk about power today, they think about it fundamentally in conflictual terms. Power is something you have to fight for. You enter into power struggles. You try to seize power. You try to, essentially engage in contests of power in order to bring about change. And certainly, that's one way power becomes expressed. That's the kind of power that operated in Gandhi's, contentious strategies, nonviolent, expressions of essentially sort of competitive forms of power. But power also takes other forms. And Interestingly enough, a lot of feminist writers have written about this, women who have tried to sort of contribute to an expanded understanding of power. And that expanded understanding has to do with the power of essentially operating in concert, cooperatively, mutually with others in order to advance collective aims, collective goals. And when one applies that sort of unifying and constructive expression of power to social change, that's the constructive program. That's constructive agency. So another thing that is helpful just to sort of think about in terms of nonviolent social change and constructive agency is the role that knowledge plays. You know, if we want to live in a more peaceful and just world, a world that's more environmentally sustainable and compassionate and so forth, which I suspect everybody on this call would like. You know, the fundamental problem is not just that we don't desire it, or not enough people maybe don't desire it. I think most people desire that. The fundamental problem is we don't know how to do it yet. Especially when we think about 7.5 billion people inhabiting an increasingly small planet. In a sense, we haven't figured out how to live together yet on this planet. We don't have the knowledge it takes yet. We have to learn our way forward into that. So transformative social change in many ways is also about generating knowledge, like new knowledge about how we can live together within new systems that we haven't yet invented, new social arrangements that we haven't yet, invented. So there's a whole interesting area of what's now referred to as social movement learning, in which various movements are sort of quite intentionally focused on the generation of knowledge and the exchange and sharing of knowledge about how do we, first of all, what strategies work, but also, what are these new patterns we're trying to build and what works, on those fronts. And related to the generation of knowledge on this front is the building of capacity, because one could also say this new world we aspire to live in, right, a world that's peaceful and just and sustainable, it actually takes capacities we haven't yet developed. Capacities at the individual level, which some people would think of in terms of, spiritual and moral capacities, but also capacities at a community level, capacities at the level of, for instance, cultures that support, these values, but also then capacities at institutional levels, like institutions that are actually capable of coming up with just and responsible and sustainable laws and policies, which, in all honesty, I think it's fair to say, we don't have those institutions in the world today. I can tell you, the United States has for a long time been held up as, this sort of model of democracy. And I think it's become pretty clear to anyone who's looking that it's a completely dysfunctional model. It's not that we don't elect the right people into the right positions, although obviously some do better than others in those positions, and some can be quite scary. But fundamentally, we've learned we can put the best people in those positions and the system is still fundamentally dysfunctional. It simply hasn't been designed to deliver what we need it to deliver. And if you think about it, the American Constitution was drafted some 250 years ago, before the invention of the steam engine, of electricity, of automobiles and computers and airplanes and the internet and weapons of mass destruction and means of mass manipulation, right? The American Constitution might as well be a prehistoric document. And the Canadian Constitution is not that much different, nor are any of the democratic constitutions one can find anywhere in the world. They actually simply are not capable of meeting the needs of humanity in this increasingly complicated and high stakes age we live in. So one has to think about building new institutional capacities that simply don't exist and learning our way into that process. And that's also what radical constructive agency is about. It's about building rather than simply dismantling. So in a sense, one could say there's kind of two processes at play in the world today. One is a process of sort of dismantling oppressive systems. But it's not enough to dismantle. One has to actually create the alternatives. And in fact, if the dismantling work gets too far ahead of the constructive work, that creates problems of its own. So let me end with an example of that. When I said Gandhi had these two sort of broad, the constructive and the contentious, he actually warned all of his fellow Indians as they were trying to throw off, the oppressive British Raj. He warned them that if we throw off the British Raj before we've come up with something better, we're just going to end up imitating what we've thrown off. We're just going to create a new oppressive system. And in fact, when they were successful in throwing off the British Raj and they hadn't yet come up with anything better, not only did they adopt a system that has been, frankly, quite oppressive since then, but actually in the power vacuum that was created, the biggest bloodbath in Indian history unfolded, far more violent than anything that happened under the British Raj, as Muslims and Hindu extremists fought for power in that power vacuum, set the entire continent into a conflagration, forced the mass migration of, killed millions of people and forced the mass migration of tens of millions of others into what became the Muslim states of Pakistan and Bangladesh and the largely Hindu, state of India. And Gandhi forewarned all of that. And what his warning was is the only way we're going to avoid this is if we prioritize the constructive program, the building up of a radically new system, which unfortunately didn't happen. And he was deeply concerned about that. So I would argue that, this moment in time today, we're really not in that different of a situation. We could put all our energy into dismantling these dysfunctional, unsustainable, systems that surround us. But what we'll do is just create a vacuum in which, what history shows is powerful elites love a vacuum, right? Extremists love a vacuum. And what really fundamentally we need is actually to have new models, new systems, that we're building up that actually inviting people into them, so that we're not just leaving a vacuum. So I'll end with that. I've spoken long enough, but hopefully these are some ideas that we can explore together. I'm sure you have thoughts, and I welcome differing views. You don't have to agree with everything I've said. We can explore your own thoughts. So let me hand it back to whoever's facilitating and we can have a conversation.
I'm not, with all the confusion, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I had to go out and download Chrome, which allowed me to have audio. But I didn't leave before I did that because I was afraid of losing you. So now I can see two of me up there. I don't know if you can, but now I'm afraid to leave again in case I can't have trouble coming back in. So I don't know. Do you want to continue, Linda? Do you want to go around the room?
Yeah, it would be nice to hear from those that are gathered here, to just hear ideas, thoughts, questions. So, Shelley, you're very good at leading us around the circle.
Around the room?
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody is in the same place as me, so I've got Jen up in the corner. Jen, do you have anything you'd like? You don't have to speak if you don't want to. I can call on you and you can just pass. That's fine.
No, basically, I've got lots to mull over, huge amount. I'm going to listen to this again because I had never thought of the insurrection happening with following the peaceful aspect, right? And I just, yeah, we've seen that so many times. And I just had never thought of it that way. So yeah, lots to mull about. That's all I have to say.
I'm moving over to Lizanne.
Yeah, I'm just impressed by the wisdom that was offered up tonight, but it brought to mind the idea of reverse engineering.
Yeah.
Sort of like what you're saying, if we could imagine the possibility and almost live the possibility and then go backwards and figure out how we got there. It's a dream, but
Yeah, I would agree.
I'm actually coming right. And if you've got questions of Michael, please go ahead. Linda, I'm actually coming back to you now.
I was talking to a friend of mine last week, and she's on the board of a Unitarian church in Colorado. And she said one thing she's struggling with is the idea, somehow the idea of having what Martin Luther King Jr. called the beloved community seems so wonderful, but how to get there? And of course, you know, I have my ideas. I was raised a Doukhobor and I'm a Baha'i now, but I'm wondering, Michael, how you would answer if somebody is, you know, that's really what we want to create, is a beloved community, sort of in our families, in our communities, and certainly in the whole world. How would you answer that? How do we create a beloved community?
Well, there's certainly probably a lot of dimensions to that. I mean, you know, for instance, obviously there are policy dimensions to it, right? I mean, the beloved community that King aspired towards wasn't possible with Jim Crow laws that segregated races. So, you know, on a very basic level, there's legal and policy sort of requirements that have to be set up. But beyond that, the other thing we can see from that US civil rights movement is you can dismantle those oppressive laws and that still doesn't give you the beloved community, right? Because in the US, in that case, you know, racism still festered in a lot of white hearts and mutated and manifests itself in new ways, right? The system of mass incarceration and other things we've seen since the 60s here. So ultimately, one has to also pay attention to the transformation of hearts and minds. That's an equally important part of this. There's like a structural dimension of laws and policies and institutions that we need, but then there's also transforming hearts and minds. And that doesn't just happen automatically. You don't just change laws and hearts and minds transform automatically. In fact, that was one of the sort of major failings or naive, beliefs that Marx had. Marx was pretty astute in his analysis of the limits or the problems of capitalism. But he assumed that if we just change the means of production, the sort of structural, arrangements of the economy, that human goodness would just sort of spring forth naturally. And that's, in my experience, naive, because human goodness needs to be cultivated actively, and it's difficult work, and it requires education and training and effort. So one of the things you know, that I've become quite aware of in my sort of like even, you know, studying social movements, the most effective social movements take training seriously. So for instance, if we go back to the civil rights movement in the 60s in the US, they took training seriously. You know, before they had these lunch counter sit-ins where, you know, blacks would go and sit at white counters and ask to be served politely, and then they'd get their heads beaten in and hauled off to jail. They went through training, extensive training, in which they actually practiced. I mean, literally, they did role plays on how to take abuse, horrible abuse, without responding violently. And it was successful. It was very effective training. And many social movements have developed various forms of training to try to actually foster, you know, their advancement. Now, that example I just gave was training for contentious strategies, right? One can also think then about what sort of training does one need for the constructive program? How do you train people to develop the qualities, the attitudes, the skills, the capabilities to actually live together in new ways, or to become the beloved community, right? So it becomes a very important system of training. Another thing you can see from the most effective social movements are that the most effective forms of training have figured out how to decentralize and replicate so they become available to as many people as possible. There's a really interesting example of this in the sort of constructive program side of things. That a book was written just a few years ago by a Black woman in the United States named Jessica Gordon Nembhard, and it's the history of economic cooperation within the Black community. And it's a fascinating book. It's just a brilliant book. I mean, it goes right back literally to the slavery times when, you know, under certain circumstances, slaves could actually buy themselves out of slavery in the South. But of course, where would they get the money to do that? It was so hard for them to get money, right? They weren't paid for the, you know, wages. But there were ways sometimes they could earn small amounts of money. And what they would do was pool their money. The whole community pool their money to buy one enslaved person out of slavery. So then that one person can actually start making wages and help buy others out. And that was like the emergence of economic cooperation in the Black community in the United States. Okay, so she traces this story over like 250 years. And there's a moment in the early 1900s where the Black community, some of you have heard of people like E.B. Du Bois, a very famous Black intellectual in the United States. You know, he and many others began to advocate for much more sophisticated forms of economic cooperation because, you know, the Black community had been emancipated from slavery, but it was still oppressed. It didn't have capital. They couldn't get loans. They were, you know, it was very difficult. So pooling their resources through economic cooperation was an obvious strategy. So in order to advance economic cooperation, one of the things they did was they sent a few sort of leading members of the Black community up to Canada to visit leaders of the Antigonish movement out in the Maritimes. Some of you might have heard of this movement, but in my experience, a lot of Canadians aren't even that aware of it because, again, we don't tell these stories about our own histories often, right? We focus on the conflict and drama. So the Antigonish movement was a movement on the eastern seaboard of sort of critical consciousness raising and training for social change, nonviolent social change. And part of that included economic cooperation. So a few of these Black leaders went up, kind of studied, learned from these Canadian, Antigonish activists, and came down and started a system in the United States of training Black folks for economic cooperation. And they set up a system of what they referred to as study circles, small groups that would get together and study materials that have been developed on economic cooperation so that they could launch some small venture. And once people had learned how to do this, they could set up a study circle for a new group and bring them in. And the movement was growing like this. Now, eventually, the cooperative movement in the US and Canada through those decades was actually gaining a lot of steam. It was a powerful movement. It eventually sort of got crushed by, McCarthyism and the Red Scare and all the sort of other insanity that developed in this country, but in the US. But that system of decentralized training within a constructive program, right, these African-American cooperative study circles is a really insightful example for the kind of training we need. And it wasn't just about how to keep the books and how to do the sort of logistical parts of economic it was also about how do you establish the relationships of trust and mutual goodwill that enable cooperative activity on that level. So that was kind of a bit of a long-winded response, Linda, sorry, but how do you establish the beloved community? Again, clearly there are structural dimensions to that, but ultimately it's also about hearts and minds and training people with new attitudes, new capacities to enter into new kinds of relationships, new patterns of community life. So there's a powerful educational dimension to that.
I'll move on to my double here, but I have John in my frame, so maybe John has something to say.
Hi, Michael.
Hey, John.
I saw something on the internet. It was meant to be a bit of a joke today, I think, but it said this person came from the 1950s expecting to see what kind of progress had been made. And what he saw was people had this little device in their hands that had access to the whole, every scrap of information available out in the whole world, but they were using it to post pictures of cats and argue with people. And so, what can we do to go a little deeper with our communications and especially, step beyond the culture wars that's manipulating people against each other?
Yeah, very important questions. I mean, my basic graduate training was in media studies, and that's what I primarily teach at the university. Social movement theory is a kind of a secondary but important area of interest for me. So yeah, when you look at the evolution of media and now smartphones and internet and social media, like any technology, it's a double-edged sword, right? Can be used for good and can be used for terrible things. We obviously live in a moment where a lot of this media is being used for terrible things, right? I mean, not just cat pictures and arguing is going on through this media, but frankly, one of the biggest uses of all this is, like pornography and gambling and, so there's a lot of ways in which these media are not being used for the betterment of humanity. And here again, I think, one has to look at two aspects of it. One is we need to foster certain forms of sort of critical media literacy, like, helping people learn how to use media in more thoughtful ways, how to seek out high quality media, how to use it constructively. So that's like an educational sort of and training dimension of this. And there are people working on that. Not enough, not fast enough, but it's a step in that direction. There's also the need to develop laws, policies, regulations around this media to actually rein in its worst excesses. And one of the things I think that's becoming really clear is, as long as most of the algorithms that drive social media are basically trying to maximize audience attention to sell that to advertisers, it will promote the kinds of polarizing, often violent, sort of dramatic conflict-based, interactions that we're seeing. So those are sort of regulatory and structural sort of considerations that need to be examined. Are there other ways to fund social media besides advertisements? And are there limits we need to put on the ability of social media to harvest and collect personal data that it then uses to manipulate us? So those are all real structural questions, policy questions. And the good news is people are starting to think about that stuff more seriously now too, even though, again, we've got a long ways to go. But I would add a third dimension to that also I think needs to change. And that is the ability for communities to reflect on how they're using media and to take an active part in trying to steer the sort of paths of media innovation and development. And that's a very sophisticated capacity for communities of people to be in conversation with one another about the media they're using and how they're using it and what they want to see it do for them and how it needs to be structured in order to accomplish that. Again, we're beginning to see those kinds of conversations emerge. We're beginning to see some communities of people come together for the express purpose of trying to actually, nudge media in new directions. But again, there's a lot of work to be done. And, in fairness, the social media stuff is so new that in some ways, we're just getting over the kind of honeymoon phase, like 10 years of wow, what is this stuff all about? And the kind of critical reflection phase is starting to advance a lot more rapidly now. People are realizing that this stuff can be dangerous and can be misused and abused.
I have Donna next. Donna, do you have a comment? You'd have to unmute yourself.
Hi, Michael. I wanted to ask you what you think about compromise as being a means to establish peaceful relationships between conflicting groups.
Well, I mean, clearly there's an important role for compromise, right? I mean, any of us have been married for any amount of time know about the importance of compromise, right? We can't always get our way. And sometimes there's no clear, path through to, to different interests or tendencies and whatnot. So obviously, I think there's a role for compromise. I think also, though, there's a deeper question at play, which is that, in some ways, the political systems we have in the world today, compromise is their highest aspiration. Like they can't do any better than compromise. At worst, it's all-out war. If it's not all-out war, it's all, social conflict of various kinds. And at best, when all the stars align, it occasionally produces compromise. Canadians are a little better at that than Americans, and that's a great thing. But even in Canada, doesn't come easy. The reason I say it's the best is because our political systems, modern democratic multi-party democracies are based on the premise that all human groups naturally organize themselves into competing interest groups. Like that's the underlying premise of modern political philosophy, of Western political philosophy, interest group competition. That's the name for it. And if we assume that humans will always organize into different interest groups and compete for their interests, then the best we can hope for is compromise between competing interests. So that's the sort of ideal state of our system. And the reason I think that that's limited is because, you know, the idea that that the best we can do is organize into competing interest groups, I would argue that's actually a self-limiting assumption. And it fails to recognize that we in fact have some common universal interests, whether we realize them or not, that we need to become conscious of. And, you know, the good news is, in some ways, we can no longer be in denial about this. So, you know, think about our warming climate and the impact that's having, the kind of existential threat that represents. Clearly, all of humanity has an interest in dealing with this problem before it gets completely out of control. Now, obviously, some people have kind of short-term material interests in trying to, like, you know, continue to profit off of fossil fuels and this, that, and the other. But, you know, in the long run, even those people are, you know, their children, their grandchildren are going to suffer from this. And there's a common human universal interest. So I think one of the challenges we face at this moment in time is actually moving beyond the mindset of interest group competition and realize our interdependence on this planet is now so complete that we can no longer afford to think in terms of, you know, continuous sort of, you know, competition for divergent interests. We have to recognize our common humanity, find those common interests and figure out how to build a world around those. So that's a long answer again, but like, yeah, compromise is necessary at the moment. It's the best many of our political systems can do. But ultimately, you know, I said anyone's been in a marriage for a while knows that we need to compromise now and then. But hopefully anyone who's been in a really successful marriage knows also that at its best, marriage transcends that kind of, you know, competing interests and compromise. And so I don't know, that's how I would think about it.
I'm going to move around because we do have some new participants, quite a few new participants. I have Michael's iPad. Michael, do you have something you'd like to say?
Well, you're covering a lot of ground here, Michael, and thank you. I just don't even know where to start, but let me try. I'm curious about, the biggest question I have is, where are the young people? They're not on this call, and I have been to climate change nonviolent protests that have used a training program for being nonviolent. I was really impressed up on Burnaby Mountain, and Indigenous elders are using that method, that methodology, and I think it's pretty effective. Where are the young people, and where are the young leaders that are buying, you know, have a grasp of this? And I'm not talking about Greta Thunberg, who's a bit young to be our leader, you know, but where are the young with experience that we can follow, you know? And I do think we're on the cusp of something. In looking at history, I think we really are on the cusp of big changes that are forced upon us. Not only people can't get along with each other, we're obviously clearly can't get along with the the planet and the resources when it comes to competing interests around profits and the discrepancy between those that have and don't have. And I'm going on maybe too long, but in this, I also think the issues are important. When I look at American politics, and you think that the right to choose whether you can have an abortion or not is settled. It's not settled, you know, when the right to bear arms isn't settled. So these are fundamental issues that they seem to get all the attention rather than those places you talked about where we do have a common interest. And I'm really hopeful that we can move to those other areas where we do have a common interest. And so the question really is about the young people. What's happening? Where are they? We're not going to be around for all this.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's key that, you know, you put your finger on a key part of this, right? And in general, in every generation, when change happens, it's driven by young people. Like when serious change happens, it tends to be driven by young people. That's just the reality of social change. And I think there's a real simple reason for that. You know, there's an age at which young people's brains are almost wired to question social norms. And that's a healthy thing. Now, as when you're a parent, it's a nightmare. You know, it's like, you know, but the reality is that this moment in young people's lives where their brains almost, you know, uncontrollably question social norms, like that's a healthy thing for human progress. That's how oppressive social norms ultimately get challenged. So young people are key. Young people also have, you know, they're at a moment in their lives where they can shoulder the burden of change in ways that sometimes older people can't, when you have children and responsibilities, or you're caring for older parents, or all the things that can, you know, constrain us as we get older. So young people are definitely key. I'm actually very optimistic about young people today. And, you know, part of that optimism comes, I've been teaching now at my university for about 25 years. So I've seen, you know, basically a couple of generations of young people. And I tell you right now, the young people I'm teaching today are fundamentally different than the young people I started teaching in the late 90s. And, you know, some of the differences are, well, yeah, you know, maybe they can't write as well because they're, you know, most of their writing is, you know, text chat, 140 characters and such. But who cares? The reality is, this is a generation that intuitively understands the oneness of humanity on a level I think no previous generation has. And part of it actually is just because they've grown up with the internet and they're in contact with humanity, literally, in a way none of us were when we were that age, right? And in fact, you know, again, like even 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. Even 10 years ago, it was hardly, you know, the case. But the music they consume, the conversations they're part of, the images they see, the food they eat, that, you know, like, this is a globalized generation in a way that is actually this is a young generation that recognizes their interdependence and their sort of organic unity with all of humanity. Now, are they all translating that into meaningful, you know, social action? Not yet, but many of them are actually, and more of them now, again, even in my own classes, than were 20 years ago. So for instance, if you think about the sort of movement for Black lives in the United States and the outpouring of activism since, like, George Floyd was killed in the summer. I know you all been watching this from north of the border, but even in Canada, I think it's had ripple effects. These are, now, one can argue about some of the strategies used and, you know, whether all these protests were effective and these sorts of things. But I've seen two things. First of all, the number of people involved in this dwarfs any social movement in history. Like the percentage of the population in this country involved in this, including especially young people, dwarfs any movement in history, including
Black Lives Matter, you mean?
Yeah, not just, I mean, people, whether they use that phrase or not, but people who are coming to the streets to voice their concerns about racial injustice in this country. It dwarfs even, the height of the 60s, countercultural protests around civil rights and feminism and the environment and the Vietnam War. Like, this is a whole different scale.
Yeah, just the question that comes to mind is, are young people being taught or understanding to work within and change, or are they seeing it as just too broken and going to challenge that power and reset, start over?
I think that's where you get a range. Like, this is where there are debates and conversations and some incoherence. They're not, young people are not sure how best to contribute. Right. I mean, some young people are still just sort of complacent on the sidelines. Don't get me wrong. It's not like everybody's sort of ready to, put their shoulder to the wheel, but far more of them are, but they're not sure how often. So they, show up at a protest. They're not sure, if it's the way to go. Some of them are moving into more traditional forms of advocacy and, partisan politics or legal advocacy, other things like that. Some of them are taking to the streets. I mean, some of them are getting involved in, vandalism and property destruction, right, in the name of social change too. So there's a whole spectrum. But within that, I think there's a lot more constructive effort than we realize, because if you think about it, how do we learn what all these young people are doing? Well, if we learn it from the news, then we can guarantee that what's being exaggerated is the most extreme and violent and conflictual expressions of it, right? Because that's what news does. And what gets lost are the quieter, more constructive, behind the scenes forms of training and organizing and working for change. And again, not enough of that yet, but I think there's a lot more than we see.
Yeah, I've seen a theory where, there's so many thousands and tens of thousands of groups working for good, but they're small and spread out, and it keeps them ineffective as opposed to joining.
Yeah, thank you. Lizanne, can I just check in with you? Are we okay to continue for a little bit longer? We are? Okay. Because I know we're keeping you longer than we said we would too, Michael. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I've got E's iPad. Is that?
Hello, I'm Peter Hollibuff. I live in Langley, Michael, so we're practically neighbors.
Yeah.
But I'm originally from the Kootenays. I come from the Dukamores, and although I don't no longer belong, I do subscribe to the magazine Iskra. And in that magazine, there's a very fine columnist by the name of Hannah Hedican. She often writes about peace and sustainability. In the last issue, her article was called Youth on the Move, and she documents how around the world youth are organizing and they are getting started to fight for a world in their own way, I guess, for a world that's more equal, more sustainable, and more just. And so I too am quite optimistic. I'm a retired teacher many years ago, and so I don't see many youth now, but I am optimistic. I think they will make a difference. If there's enough time before climate change gets us, I don't know. And thank you for your insights into Gandhi. I don't think I'll ever look at him again, Hussein.
Can I move on to Kenneth? I don't think we've seen you before. Do you have anything you'd like to ask or contribute?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I appreciate it, Shelley. And I was invited by Julie and Michael, so I appreciate their letting me know this is happening. So thank you. Yeah, Michael, you made a distinction between the contentious strategies and the constructive strategies, and it almost sounded like you would say the constructive strategies, by their merit and efforts, the other would fall away. Or the old paradigm would fall away almost naturally. It seemed a little bit too innocent and naive that there does need to be the contentious strategy, and you probably agree with that, but I'm just wondering if there's an interface between the constructive and the contentious, where the constructive, I mean, it's not so contentious. In other words, there's transformation going on within that interface between the two. And I think some of them touched on it, as far as some of the activism training perhaps contains that, but I just wanted to hear more about that because that's where I'm interested in. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a really important, the sort of boundaries, the intersections, the interplay between these. So let me offer a few thoughts. One is, when I draw that distinction between constructive and contentious, I don't mean in any way to like belittle or judge or condemn contentious activism. I think it does have a role to play. If you think about social change, one part of it is, if you think about social formations, right? The way that social arrangements get sort of consolidated, it's kind of like metal, right? When metal's, consolidated, if you want to change it, you got to heat it, you got to melt it, right? And there's a way in which the sort of contentious movements do that. That's part of that sort of dismantling, or the sort of, creating, heating up the metal so it can change. Like, it's a reality. It's part of how things change. And there are some movements that employ both simultaneously, like the landless workers movement in Brazil is a great example. I mean, they've got sort of contentious strategies and constructive strategies that are sort of married together and interacting in complex ways. There are other movements who are almost entirely contentious in their approaches, I mean, in their methods. And there are other movements, I would argue, that are entirely constructive. I mean, that put all of their sort of work into that. Those movements, I think, tend to get completely overlooked. Like, they don't even register as, oh, this is a movement for social change, because it doesn't look like the sort of, the sparks and the heat and the fire, right? And so part of what I argue is not that any of these are, let's say, doing things wrong, but that we need to expand our conception so we see the whole spectrum. And so we think about, what's needed and how we fit in and how we participate. Another thing I would say is, and actually, Gandhi, I think, made an interesting observation. This gets to, like, not judging the methods people choose. Gandhi asked, despite his whole life was about nonviolence, but he was asked at one point, what do you think about violence in the face of social injustice? And his response was quite surprising. He said, I think it's better than complacency. And I agree with Gandhi on that. I'm not an advocate of violence. And I generally try to focus my work entirely on the sort of constructive, transformation. I think that's where there's a great need. But I got a lot of friends who are involved in contentious, social action, and I would rather see that any day than complacency. The biggest problem is complacency in the face of injustice. So any form of social action, I think we need to welcome. I mean, I might draw that short of, the kind of violent revolution in which, whole societies go down in, scorched earth sorts of ways. Like, clearly I'm not advocating anything like that, but complacency is the biggest danger. And, the contentious strategies that I see around, they clearly have a role to play, and they interact in complex ways, like you said, with these other constructive strategies.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.
Anna Maria, you've disappeared. I don't know if you want to come back on. There you
Sure.
are.
There we are. Hi. I'd like to introduce my husband, Brian, and he would like to make a comment or a question or probably comments.
Michael, you had talked about visioning a new way of seeing things, but I keep hearing things that talk about socialism and sort of a Marxist view. And the utopian ideas and socialism have repeatedly failed us over history. And whenever they've been tried, we see people wanting to escape from socialism and to come to North America or Western Europe. This is where people want to be. I think we have to try to envision a future that is just within the structures that we have. And our view of justice in North America is so limited to North America. When we look at what's happening in China and the treatment of minority groups there, the animosity between Japan and Korea, between the Vietnamese and China, between Thai and Burmese, between Burmese and their subcultures. What we're talking about is a very small bit of the world when we're talking about Black Lives Matter in North America. So we're a very small little bit here. So I do think we need to envision something different, but it needs to be something that can apply to the world, not just to us.
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely. There's no society on earth that's not without its, oppressive tendencies and habits that need to be overcome. Also, I'm glad you raised this question about like socialism and Marxism and such. So let me offer a comment on that. I think we need to develop much more nuanced thinking about the sort of economic arrangements or alternatives that are available to us. So let me elaborate just a little on that. Let's take the idea of capitalism for a second. Some people equate capitalism as market economy, like capitalism is just a synonym for market economies. I think that's a very problematic equation. Capitalism is one way to organize a market economy. The concept of a market is much more elastic than the notion of capitalism. So there are many ways to structure a market economy. Capitalism is a way of structuring a market economy that privileges the interests of capital. Or in other words, it's a way of structuring a market economy that privileges the accumulation of capital and wealth over all other values. Now, that's one way of structuring a market economy. That's the American way of structuring economy. I mean, relative to that, even Canada is less capitalistic, but you still have a market economy. And, the Scandinavian Nordic countries are even much less capitalistic even than Canada, but they still have market economy as well. So I think if you ask me personally, there is and will always be a very important role for markets. The question is how we structure them and what values they sort of privilege. And probably many of us would agree that we need market arrangements that pay far more attention to environmental sustainability, the health and safety of workers, the ability for all working people to earn a reasonable, living and so forth. And in my mind, as soon as we start thinking seriously about those other values, we're no longer talking about capitalism. even though we're still talking about market economies, if you understand the distinction I'm drawing. Now, I think we can have all that without needing to talk about communism or Marxism, or frankly, I mean, socialism is kind of a complicated word. People use it in so many different ways. You know, some people would describe the Nordic market system as a kind of socialist democracy, you know, democratic system and such. But regardless of those labels, which have all become a bit loaded, my underlying argument is that we need to think about restructuring market, you know, relationships around certain values. And in that, there always remain an important role for a kind of self-regulation of market actors, like, in other words, the sort of moral development of people, consumers and producers, but also forms of regulation that rein in market excesses. So I think I agree with what you've just said, that yes, every society has its struggles, and yes, we don't need to think about, you know, we don't need to look like back to Marx for the solution to our problems. Even though he had a few insights, he also had some problematic ideas. But those would be a few of my thoughts, I guess, in response to your comments.
I wonder, Michael, if how familiar you are with there's a new business now with diversity training. And I was speaking to someone who had just gone through some diversity training at the university he teaches at. He was actually quite appalled by it. And I wondered how you view that, like how detrimental some of this is that's going on. An example is they presented a 5-point scale. So the bottom of the scale would mean that you had the fewest number of biases, a minimal level of acceptance of other cultures. The middle of the scale was unity and diversity. That wasn't very good either. And they actually went so far as to say the golden rule is completely wrong. That's a wrong concept. And from what I understood of his explanation was that it's not really that good just to appreciate other cultures because of their differences. We actually have to adapt to the norms of those other cultures, which seemed really like we really had to accept all those differences as normal. And I thought, well, that's really kind of bizarre because cultures can have good and bad aspects. So you don't want to adapt to all the norms of somebody and say, well, that's good because that's your culture. But yeah, so he was quite appalled that this training was going around. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Sure. So, you know, I've got a few different thoughts. First, it's, I would say, good news that we're starting to take seriously the questions of diversity and inclusion and these sorts of things, and try to figure out how we train ourselves to be more, you know, conscious and thoughtful in these ways. And I've been through many of these trainings, you know, universities, they're real common, a lot of businesses as well, they're becoming more common. I think at the same time, while the general trend is a positive thing we should welcome, that what we're seeing is the sort of first generation of certain forms of training that have been popularized. And now we're gaining a lot of experience and starting to learn a little bit about the limitations of the sort of framework in which that training has happened. So, and there's actually some research starting to come out now about the sort of outcomes of a lot of this kind of first generation diversity training. I mean, not first generation in terms of like the first time anybody's ever tried this, you know, people have been trying some of this stuff for some decades now, but it's become popularized and sort of mass scale. And I think it's very clear that there are some limitations and some problems with some of the assumptions built into some of the diversity training. And some of this outcomes research is beginning to show that. one of the challenges is, if the goal is to help white folks understand their sort of role and responsibility in relation to people of color and so forth, which I believe is a necessary thing, but a lot of this training is actually alienating more people than it's sort of attracting. So something's not working well on that level. And I think there needs to be more nuance brought into how this happens. So like one of the things I've been giving a lot of attention to in this regard, and I think about this question a lot that you've raised, is it seems to me that we need to come up with a better theory of what I consider the sort of psychology of change. So if your goal is to change hearts and minds, how do hearts and minds actually change? Right? I mean, how do you, for instance, lead an extreme white supremacist, of which there are far too many in the world today still? How do you lead that person into an understanding of racial equality and a commitment to that? And what's been learned about that process? The interesting thing is, there's actually a whole body of knowledge now in which people are beginning to study and learn about that. And there are ways to do that. No one is too far gone. And so there are people who are becoming quite skilled at literally like walking white supremacists out of the movements, out of those movements. And it takes incredible wisdom and tact to do that. And the sort of methods that are being employed in that work do not resemble some of the things that are happening like on university and business sites with some of the diversity training now, which can in some cases do the opposite and drive people actually towards leaning into like their sort of white identity and becoming entrenched in a sort of reactionary posture. So I think your question is valid. It's a really delicate subject, because on the one hand, there's need for change and white people bear a big responsibility in terms of needing to, really increase our sensitivity and awareness to the problems we've brought into the world. But how to do that is complicated and challenging. Now, let me add one other thing, because I think it just needs to be sort of said when we think about these topics. I think it's really important that we recognize that the whole sort of modern project, I mean like modernity, like sort of the way the Western world had shaped the modern world over the last 400 years. I think it's important, we have to recognize that racism is woven into the DNA of that project at the most fundamental level. And so it has become unconscious, systemic, and profoundly problematic. And it's been exported around the globe now in all sorts of complex ways. So like the black-white issues in the US are only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the global expressions of racism today and the subtlety and systematic nature of those. And we have to take seriously that challenge, along with a set of other challenges, like our relationship with the natural world being very dysfunctional and so forth. But the question of how do we root racism out of the modern world is very complex, delicate, difficult problem.
Thank you. I know we're already half hour over time. Is the library getting ready to close? How are people feeling?
We can stay on for another 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll go around then to people that we haven't heard from before. Just quickly, don't have your video, so I don't know if that means Anna Maria, if you can mute, because we can hear your conversation sometime. Thank you. I have a Julie. Does Julie want to say anything? No?
I'm good. Thank you, Shelley. I'm really just listening and reflecting. I really am enjoying the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Natasha? Natasha Knox?
Perhaps at this point, you could just
I
have
will-
people raise their hands.
I don't have video for everybody though. So I'm just talking to people who don't have the, so and Elizabeth Hines is there. Sue?
This is Natasha.
Oh, there's
I
Natasha.
just wanted to really express appreciation for this opportunity. It's the first time I've joined the Peace Cafe, and I'm just enthralled with the information and appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Nice to have you. Elizabeth, you've
Yeah, I'm also, I was invited by Maxine Rizika. It's my first time listening. I guess as I listen, to this very scholarly kind of analysis, I like, I'm a longtime meditation teacher, and I like to think that, when we experience our source, our that deepest level of our own human existence, that we find that we are all connected there. So to me, unless we bring some kind of meditative experience into education, where people can experience that essence of who they are and realize that we're all connected there, then it's just a bunch of words. The other thing that's recently come up for me is watching a movie on climate change. And that word has come up quite a bit tonight. And it was of a man, an agronomist, who went around and trained farmers. And he used the term drawdown. And I thought I was quite informed about climate change. I'd never heard that word before. And it needed Netflix to teach me that. So I was very grateful. And basically what he said was that we have been generating carbon into the atmosphere since 1750, since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And we can drive all the electric cars and do everything we think we're doing to eliminate creating more carbon. But unless we draw the carbon down, that's up in the atmosphere. And it was a very simple solution. It was going back to old-fashioned farming. And what's really contributing to this horrible mess has a simple solution, and a big part of the problem is that governments are subsidizing chemical companies to sell these chemicals to farmers. So that's, those may be not related to the kind of discussions that are going on right now with this group, but that's my contribution. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Actually, we recorded Paul Hanley's talk last month, and I think you'd find that talk quite interesting. He's an environmental journalist. I don't know if you know him, Michael.
I do know Paul. He's a great
guy. And so I think Lizanne has it's uploaded that. It's on YouTube, and I think because we have quite diverse conversations, I think they're all interrelated. Have you got something you want to respond to with what Elizabeth said, Michael?
Well, maybe just very briefly, absolutely. I think what you're talking about, like, rebuilding or reconstructing agricultural systems is essentially a part of this. And again, I think, it's an example of the sort of constructive work we need to do. In some cases, it's reclaiming, methods that have been lost. In other cases, it'll be developing new methods, but methods that are, work in harmony with the soil and the atmosphere and these things, absolutely essential. And I would also, I echo your concern about, let's just, be real specific, the spiritual dimension of social change. Now, how people think about that, what it means to people, it's a complicated conversation, and there needs to be room for, secular people and religious people and, people on a whole spectrum in these movements. But my personal view is that there's a intangible dimension to this that, I'm comfortable calling a kind of spiritual dimension, and people access that through various means, meditation, prayer, selfless service to others, and so forth. But I think that has to be taken very seriously in our work for social change.
Thank you, Michael. Connie, I don't think we've ever heard from you before.
Hi, I'm a first-time person on the Peace Cafe, and I just wanted to say thank you very much. It's been a very interesting conversation, and I've really enjoyed myself. And I would also say thank you to Maxine for pushing me and and encouraging me to join tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. John, JJ, you have something to say? I know you do. Oh, you're muted again.
Where is the button? Sorry for being late. I just, from the discussion I heard, was this recorded too?
Yes, it's recorded.
Oh,
So
right on. I guess everything that everybody expressed, no matter how disparate and even opposite from each other, it all fits into every single one of us. We are all, was a Roman general, he looked at a mirror, General Pogo, or I've seen the enemy and it is us. So we're the enemy and we're the solution. When John raised the question earlier about Gandhi, I reminded what the question that was posed to him when he came to Britain on the boat. And somebody asked him, "Oh, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization?" I think a lot of you remember his response. "I think it would be a wonderful idea." Yeah, all of the diversity, the problems and the solutions are inherent in every single one of us. We are ultimately responsible for everything, either through a mission or commission. And it's all, we're in our society, in our system that programs us to think that we're number one and the best. To be that way, somebody has to be number two and number three. And so then we have to get programmed into defending what we say is the best. And we see that there's, it's amazing how much what used to maybe be number one is degenerating because of our inability to control our own consumption, our own egos, again, the problem within us. And I guess until we start fixing that kind of a problem, each of us individually and collectively through things like this Peace Cafe, I guess we'll always be swimming against the current until we get strong enough to change it. But I thank you to Michael for your thoughts and to the other people for their questions and comments. I think that these Peace Cafes are wonderful, and it's just nice to see more and more people tuning in. Kenneth, that thing about not competition, but coercive and a cooperative, like to me, isn't that a dialectic? Sort of just using different words like Marx used. All of this stuff is so similar yet different. And anyways, nice to hear it. Right on. Thank you, everyone.
So I know we're running out of time. I wanted to tell Michael's iPad. I just wanted to mention that the Peace Cafe also goes into the high school. And we're hoping that this conversation that we're having tonight, that the teachers will use it in the high school as well. So we'd love to have more young people joining this conversation too. And we certainly hope to have them, but maybe by having more of these in the high school, that will happen. So I don't know, I know we're running out of time. Is there anybody who really wants to say something and keep it short? No, Michael, do you have some closing comments that you want to?
No, I've probably spoken far too long, but I appreciate all of your goodwill and the conversation we've had.
Michael, is there a way, are you available if someone had a question to contact you, or is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you looking at the chat box?
Yeah, I can certainly take down whatever you put there. Okay.
There you go, Michael. Gmail.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
Well, we obviously all really appreciate you taking your time to be with us tonight in this, well, I was going to say in this little town of Grand Forks, but we've drawn in people from different places too. And thank you, Lizanne, for being patient and staying overtime with us. That was great.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shelley.
Take care, everyone.
Okay.
Lizanne, thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Night.
Bye-bye.